January 15th, 2026. Iranian state television just broadcast footage that should alarm every American. Pro-regime demonstrators at Tehran University chanting "Death to America" while holding signs calling for the assassination of President Donald Trump.
We're watching the situation very carefully. I've made the statement very strongly that if they start killing people like they have in the past, we will get involved. We'll be hitting them very hard where it hurts.
But here's what makes this different. These protesters were holding photos from the failed assassination attempt against Trump in Pennsylvania, with captions in Arabic reading, "This time there will be no error," and in English, "The arrow doesn't always miss." This is the Iranian regime openly endorsing the assassination of a sitting US president, broadcast on government television during a government-organized event. And it's happening at Iran's worst internal crisis in decades. Over 2,600 protesters have been killed. The country's airspace was mysteriously shut down overnight. The economy is in freefall. Nationwide protests have lasted 18 days with no signs of stopping. Today, we're investigating the Iranian regime's threats against President Trump, the uprising threatening to topple the government, and whether we're on the brink of war with Iran. Let's start with what Iranian state television actually showed, because the imagery is both shocking and revealing. The footage comes from Tehran University, but this wasn't a spontaneous protest. This was a government-organized event designed to project strength when the regime faces unprecedented opposition. Demonstrators held photos of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, the highest authority in Iran's theocratic government, with power over the military, judiciary, and all major policy decisions. But alongside Khamenei's photos, some brought signs featuring Trump's image from the Butler, Pennsylvania assassination attempt in July 2024. That iconic photo, Trump with blood on his face, fist raised in defiance, the American flag behind him. Now the Iranian regime is using that same image with captions calling for his assassination. Multiple signs read, "This time there will be no error," in Arabic, and "The arrow doesn't always miss," in English. The Iranian government organized this event and state television broadcast it. This is the regime signaling that Trump's assassination is a legitimate political goal, communicating that message to its domestic audience and the international community. Iran is experiencing its most severe internal crisis since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Here's what's happening. Economic collapse. Iran's currency has crashed. Inflation is rampant. The economy is in free fall due to corruption, mismanagement, and sanctions. Nationwide uprising. According to human rights activists' news agency, HRANA, protests have continued for 18 consecutive days, with 617 gatherings in 187 cities. This isn't isolated unrest, it's nationwide. Brutal crackdown. HRANA's confirmed death toll stands at 2,615 individuals, with 2,435 being protesters, including 13 children under age 18. At least 18,470 arrested, many tortured, and forced to make confessions on state TV. Information blackout. 18-day internet shutdown to prevent coordination and communication with the outside world. Airspace closure. On January 14th to 15th, Iran suddenly closed its airspace for 5 hours. Was Iran preparing for military action? Anticipating strikes? The regime is cornered. The economy is collapsing. Thousands are in the streets. The government is killing protesters by the thousands. And Iran is potentially preparing for military confrontation. In this context, the regime's decision to organize anti-American demonstrations and broadcast assassination threats makes strategic sense from the regime's perspective. By focusing public anger on external enemies, particularly the United States and Trump, the regime hopes to redirect attention from its failures. This is classic authoritarian tactics. When facing internal opposition, create an external threat. On January 14th, Trump told reporters, "We have been notified, and really strongly, but we'll find out what that all means. But we've been told that the killing in Iran is stopping." Trump is saying he's been informed that Iranian security forces are stopping their killing of protesters. But he added a crucial caveat. We'll find out what that all means. Trump is reserving judgment on whether that's actually true. And based on the evidence, Trump's skepticism is well-founded. HRANA's data shows protests continued into the 18th day. The death toll stands at over 2,600. Arrests continue. The internet shutdown remains in effect. There's no evidence the regime has fundamentally changed its approach. But regardless of whether the killing has decreased, Trump has been clear. The Iranian regime must stop killing its people or face consequences. He's threatened action in multiple Truth Social posts. Trump's approach differs fundamentally from the Obama-Biden approach. The Obama administration pursued engagement, culminating in the 2015 nuclear deal, which lifted sanctions for temporary restrictions on Iran's nuclear program. Trump withdrew from that deal in his first term, arguing it gave Iran billions, while failing to stop its nuclear program or terrorism support. Now, in his second term, Trump is pursuing maximum pressure, using economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and the threat of military force to compel Iran to change behavior. Trump's message is simple. Stop killing protesters, abandon your nuclear weapons program, stop supporting terrorist organizations, or face devastating consequences. The airspace closure suggests Iran may be preparing for conflict. When a country suddenly closes its airspace, it's usually conducting military exercises, preparing operations, or anticipating attacks. Given the timing and context, all three scenarios are possible. The United States has significant assets positioned nearby: aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf, Air Force bases in Qatar and the UAE, special operations forces throughout the Middle East, and cyber capabilities targeting Iranian systems. The U.S. military can strike Iranian targets with minimal warning, and Trump has shown willingness to use force. During his first term, he authorized the drone strike that killed Qasem Soleimani, commander of Iran's Quds force. Soleimani's killing in January 2020 nearly led to war. Iran responded with ballistic missile attacks against U.S. bases in Iraq, though those strikes were calibrated to avoid U.S. casualties. Now, 6 years later, tensions are even higher, and the regime is even weaker. If Trump decides the killing continues despite warnings, he has multiple options: targeted strikes against military facilities, cyber attacks, support for opposition groups, strikes against nuclear facilities, or intensified economic warfare. The current wave began in early January, triggered by currency collapse. But the causes run deeper. Decades of economic mismanagement, repressive social policies including mandatory hijab laws, lack of freedom, the regime funding terrorist proxies like Hezbollah and Hamas instead of Iran's economy, and international isolation. The protests span 187 cities, from Tehran to small towns. Previous movements concentrated in major cities. This is nationwide, suggesting broad dissatisfaction. Protesters represent a cross-section of society. Young people frustrated by lack of opportunity, women protesting hijab laws and discrimination, workers demanding better wages, middle-class Iranians who've lost savings, and ethnic minorities including Kurds, Azeris, and Arabs facing discrimination. The regime's response has been systematic brutality. Security forces have opened fire with live ammunition. At least 18,470 arrested, many held in detention facilities where they're tortured and forced to confess. Iranian state TV has broadcast coercive confessions, scripted statements extracted through torture used as propaganda. The regime shut down internet access to prevent coordination and documentation. The death toll is staggering. Over 2,600 confirmed deaths, including 13 children. That's just the confirmed number. The actual toll is likely higher. For context, the 1979 Islamic Revolution that brought the current regime to power resulted in an estimated 3,000 deaths. We're approaching that number in just 18 days. This isn't a protest movement. This is an uprising, potentially the beginning of a revolution. Publicly calling for a foreign leader's assassination isn't just provocative. It's a violation of international law and could be considered an act of war. The UN Charter prohibits the threat or use of force against any state, but Iran has violated international law for decades, taking US diplomats hostage, supporting terrorist organizations, developing ballistic missiles, pursuing nuclear weapons. attacking international shipping, and attempting assassinations abroad. What threatening the US president changes is the US calculus on military action. Trump now has clear justification for any military action against Iran. The regime has publicly threatened his life. That's a direct threat to national security. The Iranian regime is facing an existential threat. If protests continue growing, the regime could collapse through revolution or military coup. The regime has strategic objectives: suppress protests through violence, control information, redirect anger toward external enemies, demonstrate strength, and deter US intervention. The anti-American demonstrations serve multiple purposes: redirecting attention from failures, demonstrating to hardliners the government is strong, signaling to the US that Iran isn't intimidated, and providing propaganda material. But this strategy is extremely risky. By threatening Trump, the regime gives him justification and political cover for military action. Trump could launch strikes against nuclear facilities, military bases, or regime leadership, and cite assassination threats as justification. Several scenarios are possible. Scenario 1. Continued stalemate. Protests continue, the regime cracks down, Trump applies economic pressure. Outcome depends on whether the movement sustains itself or the regime crushes it. Most likely near-term scenario. Scenario 2. Regime collapse. If protests grow, the regime could lose control. Military forces could defect. Government could collapse. Best outcome for Iranians and US interests, but unpredictable and dangerous. Scenario 3. US military strikes. Trump could decide assassination threats and continued killing justify military action. He could order targeted strikes to degrade Iran's capabilities without triggering full war. High risk. Iran would likely retaliate. Scenario 4. Negotiated de-escalation. Regime reduces violence for reduced US pressure. Requires back-channel negotiations. Unlikely given current postures, but possible if both sides decide confrontation costs are too high. Scenario 5. Full-scale war. If Iran attacks US interests or closes the Strait of Hormuz, the US could respond with massive force. Worst case, unlikely but possible through miscalculation. Here's where things stand as of January 15, 2026. Iranian state television broadcast demonstrators calling for Trump's assassination. Over 2,600 killed in 18 days across 187 cities. At least 18,470 arrested, many tortured. Near total internet blackout maintained. Iran closed its airspace overnight. Trump says he's been told the killing is stopping, but evidence suggests otherwise. The situation is volatile and could escalate in multiple directions. The Iranian regime faces its most serious crisis since 1979, and decisions made in coming days will determine Iran's future and potentially reshape the Middle East. We're watching a brutal regime fighting for survival while openly threatening to assassinate the US president. The regime has killed over 2,600 of its own people in 18 days because they demanded freedom and economic opportunity. President Trump faces a critical decision: accept that the regime will continue killing and threatening, or take military action. Economic sanctions haven't changed behavior. Diplomatic engagement has produced nothing but broken agreements. The options are stark. Trump has shown he's willing to use military force when necessary. He killed Soleimani when that commander threatened US interests. The question is whether those threats will be enough, or whether the next step is US military strikes against Iranian targets. The Iranian people deserve freedom from this brutal regime. The United States cannot tolerate open threats against the president's life from a hostile foreign government. In the coming days, we'll find out whether the Iranian regime changes course, or whether Trump decides the time has come to back up his warnings with action. This has been the Enforcement Files. The truth matters. Freedom matters, and holding brutal regimes accountable matters more than ever. Subscribe now, because stories like this must be told.